Girls, this is your assessment task 3. The date on which the task is due is the 2nd of September in week 8. The weighting is 25%. The task involves the following. Choose one and only one of the images provided as the basis for your own story, adopting one of the genres you have studied in class. You would all know that genres refers to the kind of story. You have studied horror stories, adventure, romance, and science fiction. To complete your stories, you will be given 4 lessons to prepare your short story in class, in which case I will be available if anybody needs some help. Your completed task must be handed in during your English lesson on Tuesday, the 2nd of September 2014. Please make sure that your response is size 12 times New Roman font, and don't forget we need a 1.5, in other words 1.5 line space within your story. Do not make your story lines too wide. The word limit is between 600 and 800 words. You will be assessed on how well you think imaginatively, that is, use your imagination, your creativity, how well you create a story, an idea, your characters, how you interpret what you have written so that it is a horror if you've chosen a horror story, or it is adventure if you've chosen adventure. Think critically about the information you want to put in your story, the ideas within your story and on which your story is based, and any arguments you want to put in to respond to and compose or write your text, that is, your story. You will respond to and compose a text so that your audience, and your audience will be for Year 7 students of 12 or 13. Your audience understands it, they can interpret it as a horror story or an adventure story or sci-fi. Think about critical analysis, if your story is pulled apart, or can we see what's happening clearly in the story? And what's your expression? Your expression must be imaginative. It must engage the reader, make your reader interested to read your story. And of course, your story must give the audience pleasure. You will be assessed on how well you show your understanding of the theme and conventions of your genre. In other words, you need to look up what are the key points of a horror story, or an adventure story, or romance story, or a science fiction story. Make sure that your story has a specific purpose. It has a proper structure, that is, your introduction, the body of the story, the conclusion, anything exciting that happens, and of course, who are you writing for? In other words, your audience. You need to use your chosen stimulus images as the basis for your short story. As the basis simply means as a starting point for your story. You must use language which is appropriate and correctly used in composing your story. In order to undertake this task, you will need to correctly identify the genre you have studied this term. In other words, look for the specific terminology you need to use, or the terms, in other words, the particular plot line, or events that can happen in a horror story or science fiction story. Choose the image on which to base your story. My advice is to look at both pictures very carefully and then see which one appeals to you, and secondly, which one can you really write a good story on. Then you can consult with me as your teacher, and we can look at the themes and the conventions, the structure, and the language choices that you can use in your chosen genre. Use your class time effectively. Don't waste time. Use your 4 periods so you can, while I'm in class, ask me questions, or if you strike a problem, maybe I can help. Make sure you submit a high quality task. Don't just hand in something that is average. You must aim for the highest possible mark. Now the two images are, the first image is of a group of children setting out on perhaps an adventure, perhaps in search of something to do with science fiction. As you can see, they're on a railway, but the railway track seems to end, and there are many waves. Maybe there's a storm brewing. Look at the clouds. The clouds are really dark. So it's a storm approaching, which means the seas are going to be very rough. These are the sorts of ideas you need to think about. Look at the second image. The second image is of a house. Now we'll notice that this house has its windows blocked out, except for the top window, which is actually lit up. Maybe somebody's in that room, somebody mysterious, or maybe there's a skeleton in that room, or maybe there is something sinister in that room, something that people would fear. The bottom of the house seems to have fog around it, and that in itself seems to suggest something strange, something eerie, and it looks as if the front door is open, inviting you in. You could make this perhaps a horror story or an adventure story. Use your imaginations. Now we come to the marking criteria. If you wish to get an A, which is in the 17 to 20 bracket, you will notice that it says extensive use of creativity. That means a very high degree of creativity, a fantastic story, in other words, and rich imagination. The girl or the student who gets the stop mark really uses her imagination very, very well. Excellent, original, and consistent characterization and plot. It's got to be really well above the others. This story must stand out to get an A. The setting must be really rich and sustained. In other words, you must keep that setting throughout the story. So don't start the horror story and then suddenly end up with a happy setting. That wouldn't get you an A. Look at the tone. If it's a horror story, it's dark, it's a fearful tone, it's a very somber tone. And if it's an adventure, it's exciting, it's discovery. extensive control and variety of editing. To edit is to correct your work. So you should be able to be very skillful, very, very good at editing your work, reading it, where are the errors, write another copy. So you edit, write a copy, edit that copy, and write again. So you could have 2 edited copies before you write your final story. And then the final one in the A box is extensive originality. That means it has to be your very own story. Do not take your story from a book or from one of the stories that we have done in class. You should have control and a variety of expression. Don't keep on using the same words or the same phrases over and over again. That story becomes boring. Look how well you construct your sentences. Be careful of that. And look at the vocabulary you use. Your vocab must be in keeping with the kind of story. So if it's a science fiction, use science fiction terms. If it is a romance story, use romantic terms. Now you'll notice in the B range, 14 to 16, instead of extensive, you've got well-developed use. So you've used it quite well, but it doesn't fit into the A bracket. Then you've got well-developed original and consistent characterization and plot, which means you've written a well-developed story, but you have not written an outstanding story. So that's the 14 to 16 range. And you've got well-developed confidence, good control and variety of editing skills, well-developed originality. Now look at the C range, which is your average range of 11 to 13. You have, instead of well-developed, you have substantial use of creativity, substantial confidence, sound control and variety of editing skills, some originality. So it's an average story. It's not a bad story, a poor story, but neither is it a good story or an excellent story. So it would get you 13 as a maximum mark, starting from 11. That's our C range. Now, if we come to the D range, you've got inconsistent instead of substantial, which is in the previous box. You've got inconsistent use of creativity, developing confidence, developing control, developing and inconsistent control and variety of expression. That would get you 8 to 10, which is D. In other words, you're not quite ready to write your story. You haven't done enough work. Perhaps you haven't followed the procedure of planning your story and writing, editing, and so on. So you need to do a great deal of work to raise the level of your story. And finally, you've got the D-E range, 0 to 7. Limited use of creativity. You haven't used your imagination very much. Lack of confidence. You don't show confidence. Limited control and variety of editing skills. You really haven't learned how to edit your work, how to correct your work to make it better. You haven't made a very serious, non-serious attempt, so that means you don't deserve very good marks. Minimum requirements of the task. You've only done part of the story, or you haven't followed the image to give you some idea. Minimum requirements of the exercise. So, in other words, you haven't used your class time properly. Little or no evidence of planning. Maybe you just couldn't be bothered with planning and you sat down and decided to write your story. And you didn't bother to look at the task rubric, to look at the requirements carefully. So that would not get you a good mark.